Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. You're watching Simon Says on MTGOacademy.com. My name is Simon Götzen and I have a core strategy opening discussion for you, which is about the number one, the fundamental axis on which Magic operates, on which Magic works, the axis of aggression. So this is going to be the topic of today. Going to keep it short, but I prepared a small slideshow so that you have something to look at while we go through. So when I talk about the axis of aggression, it's about the fundamental struggle between beatdown and control. And most of you are going to know this, but just so we know what we're talking about, beatdown is going to be defined as the deck with the lower curve, the higher threat density, that's always interested to attack the opponent's life. Now, on the other hand, control is the deck with the higher curve, the lower threat density. It doesn't need that many ways to win the game, as it's mainly interested in protecting its own life. And all of this only works because control decks win the game if it goes long enough. So this is control's main route to victory. While on the other hand, the beatdown deck is always interested in having the most impactful cards as soon as possible, and your 4 and 5 drops are going to be best if you play them on turn 4 and turn 5, although that's already pretty late for a beatdown deck. Now, one important thing to understand is that these terms are relative. You don't have the number one beatdown deck and the best control deck, but you're going to operate on an axis, which I'm going to call the axis of aggression here. Now, to the left, we have the more beatdown approach, and to the right, we have the control decks. And here you can already see that if we put two decks on this axis, A and B, we would say that A is more aggressive than B, or on the other hand, B is more controlling than A. So you can already see that aggression is relative. If I think of another deck C over here, it's going to be more controlling than A and B, but B is still more controlling than A, of course. So how would these decks match up against each other? That's an interesting question, and of course it's decided not only on a singular axis, but in a lot of dimensions. So we aren't talking about power level here. We aren't talking about the format or the overall aggressiveness of the cards available. We aren't talking about rarities. So we just want to simplify things and focus on this one aspect. Now, what's going to happen, and we can see this here, is that leaving all other things aside, a single deck is going to be favored against decks that are slightly less controlling, and it's going to be disadvantaged against decks that are going to be slightly more controlling. And why is that? Well, if your curve is at a certain point, but your opponent's curve is just a little higher, then you're going to be dominated throughout all the stages of the game. So, of course, you are at a 50-50 matchup if everything is equal, but if your opponent has a little better late game, but can still match your aggression, then you are going to be disadvantaged. On the other hand, if you are doing the same to your left, to these left decks, then you are going to be advantaged. Now, this would be the example of a mid-range deck. What happens if you are positioned on the left end of the spectrum, just as an example? This would be a classical aggressive deck. And it doesn't really matter if we're talking about limited or constructed here. You're going to be disadvantaged against the decks to the right, and you're going to be advantaged to the decks to the left. But as we can see, there's only one deck to the left, and that would mean that this strategy would be at a disadvantage compared to mid-range decks, mid-range approaches. That's not the case, of course, because this dogma of the more controlish decks being favored only holds up to a certain point. At some point, maybe here, maybe later, the control deck put too much effort into beating other control decks. So let's say the curve of the control deck is 2 or 3 average turns behind the aggressive deck. And then what happens is that there is going to be another range of decks that the aggressive deck over here is going to be favored against. So now we have an interesting geometric point to make here. What happens is that it doesn't really matter where you are on this axis, you're always going to be favored towards the decks on the left and disadvantage towards the decks on the right, but the axis is really a circle. You can connect the leftmost and the rightmost arrows here. And what we get is the circle of aggression, where it doesn't really matter where the dividing line between beatdown and control is. It might be here, it might be somewhere else. But in general, if everything is equally spaced, you're going to be favored towards the decks on the left and disadvantaged towards the right. In practice, the turning point where a deck isn't favored anymore because it's more controlling is, of course, the sweet spot that you have to figure out. Now, this is only a general idea of how such how the axis of aggression would work, and of course, in practice, these decks aren't going to be equally spaced across this dimension. So this is the next idea. Do you have an example in mind where decks are more controlling than usual or more aggressive than usual? Well, it certainly happens in certain formats. So we could say that in Zendikar Limited there was a lot of aggression going on, as there was in M12 Limited, where board control was also very important. Now, what a more general example would be that of sealed deck. What happens in sealed deck is what I call control escalation, because if you're this deck here, you are going to be at an incentive. They have the incentive to move towards the right. So what happens is that the decks get more controlling because there is a large portion of the metagame on the controllish side of the spectrum, just because sealed deck is slower and more clunky and people want to play 6, 7, 8 mana cards. So what happens is, internally, the best control decks are going to be the one that go over the top, that just play all the late game stuff, all the expensive things. And that's when the potential for a beatdown deck arises. So even though it might not be the best strategy to go for a beatdown deck, it's better to be here than here, because this poor guy is going to be dominated by the more controlling control decks, and it might even be too slow to beat the aggressive decks. So this is an interesting dynamic which you should keep in mind when playing sealed deck. Always try to answer, can I be more controlling than the other controlling decks, or is my pool set up in the way that I'm better off trying for an aggressive strategy? And this control escalation has another interesting point, because if you are in this bracket, you want to be drawing first. You want to, if you are close to your opponent on the axis of aggression, games are going to be drawn out drawn out fights, and then being on the draw is generally the better idea. So if you build the beatdown deck in sealed, you might have the additional advantage that your opponents are going to put you on the play because they think that to be the right call in the metagame they are facing. So this is the final slide. There's two things I want to mention because we oversimplified a couple of things. And the first thing is that you can always shift your position. You can shift it during drafting or during deck building, but you can also shift it simply with your play-draw decision, which I talked about on the last slide. You can also shift your position just by manipulating how combat works. Often you are really actively pursuing an aggressive strategy or a controller strategy. So each combat decision, do I attack, do I hold back, really shapes how the matchup is going to work out. And this is one of the fundamental questions on this axis: who is the beatdown? And if you attack, even though it would be better to hold back, or the other way around, you are going to lose games. And sideboarding is the last important thing I want to stress. I think it's most overlooked that you have the power to change your strategy during sideboarding quite a bit. You might not make the biggest jumps on the axis, but it might be enough to make a bad matchup favorable. And last but not least, there are ways to break the circle. You aren't locked into this position, but you might also be favored against a control deck, even though it has a higher curve. And there are certain cards and certain effects in Magic that allow the more aggressive decks to break out of this. And I just listed some that came to my mind. Discard is kind of hard to apply sometimes. Counter Magic might be interesting for a tempo-oriented deck that just needs to keep the opponent off his more powerful spells. And the last two ones are so versatile and tough to handle for control decks. X spells, primarily Burn, and of course, if you happen to have a Planeswalker, Mythic Rare, then you're going to open the game up in another dimension, and control decks, being focused on the defensive, are going to have a very hard time to beat these Planeswalkers. So that was my core strategy intro on the axis of aggression. I hope you like it and enjoy the first M13 draft right after this. Bye.